Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Poll 205 Women in Politics. This week is all about women's representation in the United States government. Now, I know that you have a reflection paper due this weekend, so I will do my best to keep this video short. This week, I want to talk to you about 3 major points. First, we'll talk a little bit about women's representation in the U.S. government, focusing mostly on Congress, and I'll share some historical statistics with you. And second, we'll talk about why women struggle to gain equal representation in government. We'll explore differences in men and women's political ambition, as well as the normative expectations of women in American society. So, let's get started. To put things into a little perspective, approximately 12,000 people have ever served in the United States Congress. That's from our nation's inception in the late 1700s to today. Of that 12,000 approximation, only 393 have been women. That's about 3%. Now, this is largely because for the first 200 years of our democracy, there was virtually no women elected to national office, and they couldn't even vote, but things have changed a lot over the last few decades. Currently, there are 119 women in the House of Representatives. That's about 27%. And 24 women are in the United States Senate. So overall, about 27% of the entire Congress, meaning both the House and the Senate, is female. But if we compare the gender breakdown in Congress to that of the United States population, we start to see a big disconnect in representation, whereby men are overrepresented in Congress and women are underrepresented. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that the United States ranks 76th globally when it comes to the proportion of women serving in the national legislature. Well, you might be asking yourself, what accounts for such representative disparity in the United States? One reason has a lot to deal with structural differences between the United States and other countries' systems of government. You see, most countries at the top of this list utilize proportional representation in their electoral systems, whereas the United States, on the other hand, relies on something called single-member districts. Let's take a look at both of these systems in a little bit more detail. Let's start with single-member districts, since that's the electoral system each of you are perhaps most familiar with because it's what we use in the United States. Let's just take Wisconsin, for example. Based on Wisconsin's population, the state has 8 distinct congressional districts. Remember, the number of representatives each state receives is calculated by how populous that state is. States with more people in them are allotted a greater number of representatives in the House of Representatives. Now, every 2 years, when it's time to elect members to the United States House of Representatives, a variety of candidates will challenge each other within these districts. And because only one candidate can represent each district, we refer to this electoral system as single-member districts. And the one thing that you need to keep in mind about these districts is that they're often drawn in a way to advantage specific political parties. In most states, it's the state legislatures that are often controlled by a specific party that are charged with the responsibility of drawing these districts in the first place. So remember, in case you're unfamiliar with these political science terms, when congressional districts are drawn in a way to advantage a specific political party, we call this gerrymandering. So even though most voters in Wisconsin generally support the Democratic candidate in a presidential election, because districts are drawn in a way to advantage specific parties, you can end up in certain scenarios where where one party has greater representation than the other. And so to illustrate this in a little bit more detail and how congressional districts work, let's take our district, Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district, as an example. Ron Kind has represented Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district since 1997, and in 2020, this past November, he ran for his 12th re-election bid. This past November, Kind narrowly won his re-election by a margin of about 3 percentage points and about 10,000 votes. But you see, one of the problems with single-member districts is that there can only be one candidate who actually wins the election. That means that 48% of voters in this election have no choice but to be represented by a candidate they did not vote for. And so that means that almost half of the entire 3rd congressional district in Wisconsin is represented by someone who they didn't vote for. And what's interesting about single-member districts is that it doesn't matter how much or how little you win by. As long as you get more votes than anyone else, the district is yours. This is what we refer to as first past the post voting. Imagine that these were the results instead. Now, imagine that 40% of voters voted for Ron Kind, 30% voted for Van Orden, and imagine the other 30% voted for a specific third-party candidate. Now, even though none of these candidates were able to secure a majority or 50% of the votes, Kind would still win the election because he received more votes than his competitors. Again, this is what we refer to as first past the post voting rules. And that's exactly how our elections work here in the United States. Proportional representation, on the other hand, aims to create more equitable representation for everybody. You see, if we adopt proportional representation in the United States, we would likely abolish all of these different congressional districts in each state, and Wisconsin would likely retain its 8 members in the House of Representatives based upon its population, but the entire state would vote for which party they wanted to represent them in Congress, not specific districts per se. It would look a lot more like how states vote for president. So remember the image that I just showed you. 5 out of the 8 congressional seats in Wisconsin are represented by Republicans. And if we did some quick math here, 5 divided by 8, well, that means that 62% of Wisconsin's representatives are Republicans. And if about 62% of the state's voters voted as Republicans consistently across all kinds of different types of elections, then we would expect this to be a pretty solid form of representation, right? But that's just not the case. Compare that with how Wisconsin voted in the 2020 presidential election. In fact, 20,000 more voters voted for the Democrat than the Republican candidate. And obviously there's differences here between who we want representing us at the national level versus the state level, but this is just an example. It seems like a system of government might be a little bit more representative if we were closer to these figures here. About 50% of voters are Democrat and about 50% of voters are Republican in the state of Wisconsin. And so if we voted for congressional candidates on a proportional basis, then we would expect 50% of Wisconsin's 8 seats should be represented by Democrats and 50% should be represented by Republicans. In other words, each party would get the number of seats proportional to the entire vote share. So in other words, each party would get 4 seats. Proportional representation also makes it extremely easier for third-party candidates to get their foot in the door. Now, oftentimes, third-party candidates can easily gain about 10% of the vote, but rarely do they ever gain more votes than their competitors, and thus their election is dead in the water. Proportional representation incentivizes diversity in its elections, unlike single-member districts. So just take Wisconsin as an example again. If let's say 48% of voters voted for the Republican Party in a congressional election. Republicans would get 4 of those 8 seats because 48% of 8 is about 4. If 26% of voters chose the Democratic Party, then they'd get 2 seats because 26% of 8 is about 2. And if a third party was able to get around 26% of the vote as well, they could also get 2 seats in Congress. Thus, in this type of electoral system, even if the math might be a little bit more confusing, the main takeaway here is that everybody is represented by a candidate or a party that they voted for, unlike the single-member district system where whoever gets the most votes has to represent everyone. And the reason that I bring all of this up is merely to illustrate that our political system is specifically designed to safeguard against rapid change. And I don't know how many of y'all have read the Federalist Papers, but when the founders were designing our government, you can read this. I mean, they were quite upfront about this. They thought that the people, the average person, was essentially too selfish or too stupid to effectively govern themselves. Now, you may agree or disagree with Madison's point here that if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. The point of the matter remains is that it is these structural components of government, such as the type of electoral systems we have, the type of rules that we use to elect specific individuals, that those can either be a major liability or a significant advantage for underrepresented groups and interests. And unfortunately, as we'll discuss throughout this course, our government has a very long history of engaging in tactics that specifically marginalize or disenfranchise specific groups of people in society. And the rules of the game are designed to ensure that those who are already in power stay in power. And it's one of the reasons that it's so difficult to get any meaningful change out of either party. And if these major parties don't make it a priority to get more women or minorities elected, then nothing changes. And that's why it's no coincidence that countries with proportional representation elect far more diverse groups of people than do countries with single-member districts. Lastly, on the topic of structural factors, some countries even enforce gender quotas in their national elections. Now, this takes a variety of forms depending on which country you're looking at, but most countries either reserve a certain amount of seats in parliament for women, or political parties will mandate that a specific percentage of their nominees must be women. The bottom line is that there are structural mechanisms in place that can dramatically enhance women's representation in government. And now I want to turn it to you. What do you think? Do you think that elections would be fairer in the United States if we adopted a system of proportional representation? Do you think that Congress would ever pass a law mandating gender quotas in our institutions? This would be a really great topic for you to explore in your research, in your reflection papers. Ambition is another reason why women's representation lags in the United States. In a survey of 801 adults in 2016, when asked, "Do you think that you are very or somewhat qualified to run for public office?" nearly half of the men in the survey believed that they were, whereas only a quarter of women believed that they were qualified to run for office. This graph also illustrates the mediating impact of age, education, and partisanship on how men and women answered this question. And I'm not going to go into this chart in too much detail because this is the focus of next week's lecture, but this is a brief introduction into what political scientists refer to as the gender gap. This refers to gender-based differences in public opinion, party preferences, and vote choice. Again, stay tuned because we will break down the gender gap in a whole bunch more detail next week. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why do women have less political ambition than men? Why do women think that they are less qualified to hold elective office? And a lot of that boils down to the very final topic of today's lecture: normative expectations of women in society. In 2014, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey with about 1,800 participants and asked them this very question: why do you think more women aren't in elective office? And the gender gap within the responses is notable. Female respondents were nearly twice as likely than men to believe that women are held to a higher standard. Female respondents were also more likely to believe that Americans are not collectively ready for more women in office, and that women get less support from party leaders. So while there are certainly some structural elements that may make it more difficult for underrepresented groups to get a foot in the door, one of the biggest reasons why we don't have more women in Congress is simply because many women don't believe that they're qualified to run for office, and they don't run for office. And as we'll discuss later in the semester, when women run, they are just as likely to get elected as men. But the reason that women's representation in Congress is so low is mostly a function of the fact that women aren't running for office. And as we can see from this data here, a lot of the reasoning behind these attitudes, it stems from perceptions that women may be viewed as socially subordinate in society. They may be held to different standards, or they can't readily identify support networks to help women advance their political ambition. There's much more that we have left to discuss regarding the gender gap in American politics, and I think that you will really enjoy the lecture that I have planned for you on this topic next week. But I did promise that I would do my best to keep this lecture on the shorter side, since you do have a reflection paper due at the end of this weekend. So I just want to leave you with a few questions to help you write your reflection essays this week. So first, more than half of all the countries in the world have instituted some type of gender quota. Do you think that the United States could ever adopt such a mandate? Why or why not? Second, what do you think is the biggest obstacle preventing more women from seeking political office? Is it structural factors like our electoral system, or is it attitudinal, women not believing that they are qualified to run for office? And finally, women are significantly more likely to believe that they are held to a higher standard, which inhibits their political ambition. Explain why you agree or disagree with this statement. Is there any empirical evidence to show that women are in fact held to a higher standard, or is this just something people believe? Well, that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.